The video that just opened this lecture had members of the Tea Party movement and Occupy Wall Street, two very different political movements, at loggerheads with each other, active in protesting. And you have to ask a question: why do members of these movements take time out of their lives to engage in political activity? Think about it. You get beat up by the police or audited by the IRS. Opinion makers of the other side will call you the second coming of the US Civil War, a fascist, a communist, whatever you want. You get stressed, yelled at, and you yell at people. Sometimes you get punched and punch people, or even shot and shoot people. Not fun. I mean, sure, there's a minority of people that enjoy this, but most people don't. Well, the video above gives us some explanations of motivations. It seems that the common theme is that they are not happy with how the government distributes something.
For the IRS to be as invasive, as intrusive, and as discriminatory as they've been towards different groups, whether they're liberal or conservative, is just wrong.
For those inside.
Listen to the people and stop taxing us and taking away our wealth against our rights. Represent us.
Occupy Wall Street is a movement where we elevate ourselves, the people of the world, as equals in power with the 1%.
The top 1% have experienced dramatic income gains over the last 30 years. Most Americans have not.
They are active because they believe they are the losers of the political game. They believe, fairly or unfairly, that they have been denied resources or money by those who they term the strong, usually the government. As the 1920s cartoon in the PowerPoint points out, these worries are not new. Thinking that this may be the case is not wrong. Politics can be understood as the process by which a society decides who gets what, when, where, and how. We have politics because we live in a world of limited resources but potentially unlimited needs and wants. So societies need to make a decision about which needs will get satiated and to what level. Think of this example. We do not have unlimited time on our hands. One of the reasons we have created the government is so that we can redistribute time. We use the government to cut down on the time needed for procuring things like safe passage to other countries, passports, firefighting, the fire department, finding help in our time of need, the welfare state. The time we will use up trying to provide these things on our own is saved for us. But in turn, we make demands on the time of the government workers tasked with getting us these things. In other name, we save time and they lost time from their life. This is serious, as time is not infinite, especially for mortal creatures like us. The want of politics can be anything: money, things, influence, time, the most precious resource, as I pointed out. But it can be things like affection, respect. It can be both tangible and intangible things. The important thing is that we all agree that not everybody can have an equal access to these things. That if we have equal access to these things, then they are going to run out or they lose their meaning. That there is an inequality that has to be managed by society through politics. The essence of politics thus is that it's essentially a system for distribution scarce resources in which financial trade and violence play a secondary role. Unlike violence, politics tries to distribute resources with the minimum destruction of those resources and the human relationships built around their management. Unlike trade, politics covers the distribution of things beyond services and goods, intangible, hard to measure things like influence, pride, what prejudices will have the formal law, and above all, power. So politics is non-violent, but that does not mean non-coercive. The threat of violence can be a strong incentive for people to engage in politics. It is not market, but does not mean that supply and demand do not play a role. And its main tools are compromise, debate, cooperation, discussion, nonviolent coercion, bribery, and deceit. In another name, essentially negotiations of various forms. The classical clip you watched from the hit series Game of Thrones is excellent because it nicely encapsulates one of the most important resources in politics, which is power. Power is the ability to get people to do what you want them to do. And in politics, in political power, it's the ability to do so without fighting them physically. Power indeed is the marrow of politics, the core of politics, because it's the most important resource, because it is essentially acts as a replacement for more substantial things. As Varys points out, power itself is a numbers play. It is a made-up concept. And yet, if you have enough power, then you can get things done for a fraction of the real cost. You exchange power for real, tangible or intangible things of importance. A powerful person doesn't need to ever raise armies or empty his coffers and treasury or her coffers and treasury or their coffers and treasury. Influence, respect, and responsibility will get the things that violence or money could do so instead. So above all, politics is about the distribution of power. Who has power and who has not? Who needs to use violence or to buy the things they need? And who only needs to say, this is my right?
Power is a curious thing, my lord. Are you fond of riddles?
Why? Am I about to hear one?
3 great men sit in a room. A king, a priest, and a rich man. Between them stands a common sellsword. Each great man bids the sellsword kill the other 2. Who lives, who dies?
Depends on the sellsword.
Does it? He has neither crown, nor gold, nor favor with the gods.
He has a sword, the power of life and death.
But if it's swordsmen who rule, why do we pretend kings hold all the power? When Ned Stark lost his head, who was truly responsible? Joffrey, the executioner, or something else?
I've decided I don't like riddles.
Power resides where men believe it resides. It's a trick, a shadow on the wall.
And this, of course, raises the question of the purpose of politics. What do we want to produce from it? Well, primarily, we want to keep things stable in society, but we would like to avoid using violence to do that. In a way, politics is a very small-c conservative enterprise. A radical, violent chase is to be avoided. A violent breakdown of social order is to be avoided because that means a breakdown in power, and then you actually have to spend money or use violence, which also destroys and spends resources to get things done. No wonder many people correctly see the political system as really a system to keep the current distribution of power and resources in place, which usually benefits the strong either in qualitative terms or quantitative terms. That's why an anarchist like Peter Kropotkin will point out, hey, does that not just help the already powerful, the ones on the top? Rebel, I say. That's not the case. Think of this. Power is not infinite. Resources are not infinite. Only the most idiotic or desperate of ruling elites will make it impossible to change things without the use of force. They will quickly expand their political power, then their means of violence, and will end up overthrown. The powerful want to remain on top, but they also want to remain there for a long time, and they want to remain there on the cheap. So they have an incentive to accommodate the demands of the non-powerful. And they do that through the negotiations of politics. Okay, then you might say, I don't like politics. What if the system is just too corrupt? Well, one option is to return to the pre-political stage of deciding the distribution of resources, mainly violence, beating up people. We can fight over things. That thing, that woman, that man, that love, that child, that water, that respect and prestige. But this might not be a better world. Getting on the top will be ephemeral, as the rounds of fighting will take their toll. There will be no society to speak of, and one is still stuck with an elite that lords it over all the others, even if this elite lasts only until the next fight. This is the world which quite eloquently the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes described as the pro-political world. A world where life is so short and brutish that our ancestors invented government to get away from it. A world where Homo homini lupus, the human being, was a wolf to the other human being. You might think that you might do well in such a world. There's a lot of people who hope for an apocalypse because they think they're the top dog. But as Hobbes points out, even the strongest fighter has to go to sleep and can be murdered in their bed. Even the strongest fighter can be poisoned in their food. The world of pre-politics, where violence rule, is a world of instability, is a world of insecurity, and most human beings, except from a small minority, don't want to live like that. Well, another alternative is the libertarian idea. Let's make everything marketable. Safety, war, love, life. Let us put a price for everything and base it on supply and demand, and rather than use negotiation, just use money. The simple suggestion is to extend the market that exists for services and goods to those things that are intelligible. If we do that, then we could distribute everything according to supply and demand, and thus need neither violence nor government to resolve questions of who gets what, where, and how. While the market is a pre-political institution just like violence, a market in everything will be a post-political institution, something that renders politics useless. The issue is, can everything be measured in money? Will not the market system for everything make an inordinate demand for our time? In the end, will we still not need to delegate a lot of our life decisions to agents? Think about it. People who can afford it pay other people for decisions like how to decorate my home, where to go for a vacation. So would we not end essentially hiring something akin to politicians? Also, markets only guarantee an economically efficient outcome. That does not mean a fair, just, or humane outcome. Market politics might demand that you and your family starve to death. You might not be willing to accept that. For those who face the danger of dehumanization because of their failure to get what they need in the market, will not force be a final resource. So what exactly do we gain then? We're kinda in the worst of politics, the worst of Homo homini lupus, and the worst of the market. Anarchists then go and say, well, there's the anarchist alternative. In this case, everything is distributed according to the wants and needs on essentially a demand basis. The idea is that when we rationalize our needs so much that we can readily satisfy them with extant resources, there will be no scarcity. There'll be enough for everybody. The issue with anarchism is that it may require a human being that does not exist, or makes assumptions that the real needs of people are easily fulfilled by extant resources, and also raises the question exactly who decides what a real need is or not. Now, whether these are credible alternatives to politics for you is something you have to decide on your own. I can't do that for you. Technology might make the impossible possible. But right now, for most people in the world and for most societies, these are not credible alternatives for politics. Okay? Again, I'm not saying you're wrong to believe in them. You have the right. It might work for you. I'm just saying for the majority of people, they seem that these are not going to work, and they're stuck with politics, bad or good. Now, politics works on the distribution and management of power, but power works through two very different paths when it comes to politics. One is through legitimacy and the other one through authority. Now, they are connected, but they are two different concepts that come together as the essence of government. Now, to have authority means that others are willing to obey your decisions whether they like them or not. It means you have power over them. And authority can be conferred by the use of violence or the threat of the use of violence. But it can also be conferred by legitimacy. To consider something legitimate is to consider that whether it hurts us or benefits us in the short term, it is for our benefit in the long term. For example, we hate taxes, we hate paying fines, but in the long term, we believe that the use of these things makes our life better by funding various services that we like or deterring behavior from others that we don't like. Legitimacy rests on authority. You need to have authority to be able to get legitimacy, but then has an embedded effect by essentially making people want to obey you because they consider it in their best interest, even if short term they consider it to be hurt. They're not obeying you anymore out of fear. They're obeying you because they consider it pragmatic and in their interest. To go back to the Varys power question, in the end, all that matters is whether the man with the sword believes that the only person that can legitimately decide when his sword is to be used is the king. It's unimportant if the others have money or gods on their sides. If the man with the sword believes the king has the right to tell him kill, then the man in the sword will obey that. If the priest he believes has legitimacy to do it, then he will obey that, and so on and so on and so on. So legitimacy is excellent because it's even cheaper than just authority. People willingly take on short-term losses and obey you and work with you because they consider that in their interest in the long term. So what does this mean for everyday life? Even legitimate authority supports social order. And violence follows breakdowns in legitimate authority. If an institution or government loses its legitimacy, then it can only back up its authority by force. Might is right. So when a government loses legitimacy, it has to use its military force. But military and police force cost money and human lives. That means expending precious resources to the point where the government becomes an easy target for an attempt at violent overthrow. Remember, the goal of politics is to never get to that point of civil war. Now, how does a government lose legitimacy? By not responding to the demands for change or by responding to such demands with actions outside the rules. But it takes time and effort to undermine a government. Simply being apathetic will not do. If you consider the government illegitimate but do not act sure, then it doesn't account. Why? Because others will just assume that you still consider it legitimate. For the loss of legitimacy to count, it must be mass across society, and that can only happen when the people who are unhappy and consider the government illegitimate are willing to take risks. This is why totalitarian states are so successful. The way totalitarian states work is by essentially making you believe that everybody might be an agent. Usually by actually having a massive amount of people on the payroll of the government as spies. In Eastern Germany during the communist years of the Cold War, 1 in 7 people were members or agents for Stasi. This meant that people were very careful in expressing their anger or unhappiness with the government because they were afraid of going to prison. Only when external signals showed that the government was not going to prosecute people anymore, then people went out and expressed their anger and threw down the wall. So you have to express your anger if you want change. If you keep it inside you, then it's meaningless. Apathy means disenfranchisement. Disenfranchisement means that you confer legitimacy to the government, whether you like it or not. An example of a collapse of legitimacy were the draft riots in New York during the Civil War. People lost their trust to the system of rules and institutions of government. They believed that the lottery for deciding who will be conscripted to go and fight for the Union Army was unfair and corrupt. They took matters to their own hands. Violence was endemic. How did it end? Well, let us see. As I pointed out, and as we can see from the movie, an institutional government that loses its legitimacy can only back it with authority. Might is right. The New York Civil War riots were put down with extreme prejudice by the Federal Army and the New York State Guard, which opened fire on the rioters and killed them, and that's how the city was pacified. Of course, later on, the government took some policies to satisfy some of the demands of the population because it wanted to rebuild the legitimacy it had lost. This was a successful example of the government reasserting authority. But in other places, the collapse of the government leads to endemic civil war that is never restored. For example, in Somalia or Afghanistan or in Syria right now.
From 18th Precinct, the mob are sacking houses 27th Street and 7th Avenue. We have no force to send. From the 16th Precinct, all the stores are closing on 8th Avenue from fear of the mob in 17th Street.
Show us what you've got, you cowardly bastards!
From 4th, the rioters are attacking colored boarding houses, robbing them, and setting them on fire.
From 21st, the mob have just broken open gun store on 3rd Avenue.
How many down?
Marshal's office on 3rd Avenue is burning down. The police is of no avail. Soldiers now on 38th Street. The mob will not disperse. What are your orders? What are your orders? Keep your side steady now, steady. Let's stick together. All right.
True, halt! Present! Order you to disperse! Fire!
So if a government loses legitimacy by violating the rules, how does it gain it? Government retains and gains legitimacy by acting through the rules and institutions we have all agreed to populate politics with. You know, the things we use in order to manage, to do politics. As long as the government plays by the rules and the citizens know and accept those rules, then it is very hard to lose legitimacy. And that also holds for dictatorial governments, authoritarian governments. As long as they're not arbitrary, and as long as there's transparency in the way that the authoritarianism works, people will accept it for a very long time. Now, rules can take many forms. Unwritten tradition, for example, the United Kingdom, constitutions, laws, bylaws, etc. Rules tell us how things are supposed to be done. Now, it is true that government sets the rules, and government usually represents the winners of the political game. However, the issue here is not so much who sets the rules, as that the rules are set, are clear, and permit everybody some way to participate in the distribution of goods within politics. Institutions are the places in which politics takes place. They can literally be a place, like the White House, or a collection of people, or even a very specific individual. What is important is that it is clear to all that these are places where decisions are made. In the end, what we want from rules and institutions is stability. We want to know not only how things are done right now, but also have a good expectation that things will be done this way or that way tomorrow. Because this saves us time, it saves us money, and permits us to build social relations we can leverage to get things. Classical horse trading. Think of it this way. Let's take football, okay? And there's Socrates explaining football rules, American football rules, okay? This is American football, not soccer, okay? Explaining the rules to ancient Greeks. What would happen if the rules for scoring a touchdown in football had to be debated and agreed anew after each touchdown? What will happen if what counts as a football stadium could be changed every day? And one day it's a tennis stadium, the other day it's a soccer stadium, the other day it's a sumo wrestling ring. Would most of us enjoy such a game, either as players or spectators? Now, I know some of you, just because you want to troll, are going to say, sure, Professor, I would love it. But we're not talking about you. We're talking about the majority of us. And probably the majority will not enjoy it. It's the same thing with politics. We want stability. And we don't enjoy politics the way we enjoy sports. So we demand extra stability from that. And that's what rules provide. Who gets what, where and how and when, with clear stability. This, of course, raises some questions. As I pointed out, politics is not totally divested either from violence, the fear of violence, the threat that if you don't play according to the rules, the result will be a return to the pre-political state of violence, plays a very important role in keeping people within the political system. And also, politics is not totally divested from market forces, from supply and demand. And one of the biggest questions for our society is the one about the relationship between economics and politics. How much of human life is determined by politics? How much by market forces? This may be the biggest issue in politics for most people because, one, money is part of power. It is a resource that confers power. Two, money is scarce. Artificially scarce if you want, but it is scarce, okay? For money to make sense as a medium of exchange, people have to agree that there can't be as much money as we would like in the world. And three, markets are efficient, but not necessarily fair, humane, or just. And four, and finally, also political decisions to distribute goods and money are hard because of the limits of human capacity for information. We're not supercomputers. Is the economic system going to be basically capitalist, in which the means of producing goods are in the hands of private citizens and the distribution of most goods are determined by the market, and many things are distributed on the basis of economic supply and demand rather than on the basis of political decision making? Or is the system going to be socialist, in which the means of production are not in the hands of private citizens and that distribution of most goods is decided by politics, whether those politics are authoritarian fiats by delegated representatives or by essentially voting on every decision? If capitalist, how much, if any, regulation will it have? Will it be like Singapore and Hong Kong that used to be free market havens where very little regulation existed? Will it be like the United States where there's some regulation? Or will it be more like a social democracy as in Sweden? If socialist, will economic decisions be made by the state, as in most historical examples, or by society, as in the case of anarchist communes? These are fundamental questions on which a lot of us disagree. I mean, if you go down to the basis of it, it's a question between the role of a state in assuring procedural guarantees, or what we call equal opportunity, or substantive guarantees, or what we call equal rights. The role of the state in the economy can vary from providing a procedural guarantee, promising to treat all equal before the law, but not that the results of economic activity will be equal for all, or providing a substantive guarantee that no law will stand in the way of making sure everybody has an equal share of the material production of society. There is no state in the world, and has never been any society, organized society in the world, that had the ability to produce surplus that wasn't completely one or the other side on this. Instead, there are various mixes between procedural guarantees and substantive guarantees throughout the world. Of course, ideologues of different sides argue that it should be on one side, for example, libertarians, just procedural guarantees, socialists and anarchists, just substantive guarantees, but those are ideologues. They speak about a world that does not exist and might not exist. But when we see pragmatic politics in organized societies, where we're talking about tribes, whether we're talking about states, whether we're talking about counties, communities, there is a mix of this. But the mix exactly is a debate of who gets what, when, where, and how. The video you watched brings us to the second question, which is what exactly will be the political system? I mean, politics is the same within every political system. It is a question of who gets what, when, where, and how. But the who, the what, the when, the where, and the how change from political system to political system. And that can have a very big impact on who is the loser and who is the winner in the political system, and how often they're the loser or how often they're the winner. One political system can be monarchy with King Stewie, in which King Stewie decides who gets what, when, where, and how. And none of us has anything else to say. But in reality, most societies have developed a bit more nuance and complexity in answering these questions.
I am the supreme ruler of the neighborhood of make-believe. All will kneel before my... Ugh, what kind of freaking king lives next to the train tracks?
So an economic system can vary on how much goods are distributed by markets or by politics. What about political systems? How do they vary? Let us go back to hollow antiquity and take the word of an old dead Greek man, Aristotle. I'm a Greek man, so I can claim back to the Greek man. Okay? For Aristotle, governments varied by how big the group of decision makers was and whether they were legitimate or not. Legitimacy for him was based on the concept of virtue. An example, how much the government tried to help people live a good life according to the ancient Greek ideas of what a good life is. I'm pretty sure King Stewie will end up in the tyranny category. So he designated political systems between monarchy, which is legitimate rule by one person, versus tyranny, which is illegitimate rule by one person. Aristocracy, which is legitimate rule by a small subset of the people who are affected by political decisions, versus oligarchy, the illegitimate rule of a small subset of the people who are affected by political decisions. Democracy, the legitimate rule of the majority of the people who are affected by political decisions, versus mob rule, the illegitimate rule of the majority of the people who are affected by political decisions. And we can actually see legitimacy in this class as being conferred by the absence of arbitrary decision making, that the ruler, whether it is one person, a minority, or the majority, rule according to stable and known rules, okay? Clear rules and not arbitrary. Nowadays, we tend to combine the first two types of regimes, monarchy, aristocracy, or tyranny, and oligarchy, in the authoritarian category, and we keep democracy by itself. To a point, we do this because most of us have accepted in the world the main democratic idea of legitimacy, that the government tries to represent the interest of most of us, if not all of us, and is responsible to us as the people, you know, capital P. Most authoritarian regimes in the world claim to represent the interest of their people as well. But if we look at the roles of politics in them, we will see that the majority of people have no way to influence the political process without recourse to violence, or in many cases, there is a continued trend of arbitrary decision making. Now, this does not mean that such systems cannot be legitimate. Indeed, most dictators and authoritarian rulers rule their countries without having to use force on a huge scale every day. Most of them are like the Vietnamese Communist Party, rather than, let's say, for example, Bashar Assad of Syria. But legitimacy in dictatorships does not come from the obedience of the government to specific rules and institutions when it comes to the political process. Instead, ideas like divine right, take, for example, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, nationalism, take, for example, Vietnam or Russia, or revolutionary fervor, take, for example, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea or North Korea, are marshaled to reduce the need to use force to back government authority. That tends to make them more fragile in many ways than democracies, where legitimacy is based on a stability of institutions, of rules, of who gets what, when, and where, and how, that many times can last for a very long period of time. Think about the United Kingdom. Its modern democratic system has been approximately 200 years old, 150 years old. Or the United States of America, since the expansion of the franchise since the 1850s, but you can also say after the Civil War, has been a democracy for the majority, not for everybody. Important big minorities like African American, Native Americans were excluded for a very long period of time. And even if we, start counting from the 1970s and the end of Jim Crow, compared to some other states, U.S. democracy is quite old. Nowadays, we also differentiate states by how much they intrude in the lives of their citizens. A libertarian state tends to be minimalist, and really speaking, only foreigners and people breaking the law interact with the state. The totalitarian state, on the other hand, not only controls the economy, but also seeks to control how you dress, what you eat, what you drive, when you sleep, and ultimately, if it can, what you think. Think of living under a totalitarian state as if living continuously submerged in water, grasping for breath, sometimes getting a small breather, before a heavy hand forces you under the water again. And yes, it is that nasty. I've experienced some of this repression in my previous country where I was living, Turkey, and I was a foreigner. People in Turkey had it much worse. And make no mistakes, a king could be totalitarian, a small elite could be totalitarian, and the majority could be totalitarian. We tend to think of totalitarianism as something new, a result of the expansion of communication and transportation technology in the 20th century that provided the state with the ability to intrude in the lives of people in ways that it could never do before, but that's not true. At a local level, you had totalitarianism in villages which, controlled completely the life of their members, in small rural communities, within cities, within guilds, and so on. So, totalitarianism has been with us as much as has been libertarianism. Human social and political life has always been this clash between the libertarian ideal and the totalitarian ideal. The idea of every person being free to do whatever they want as long as they don't hurt others, and the idea that the community and society must be regulated and regulate the individual for their own good. Now, most countries, as most societies, fall in between the two extremes, with some government intrusion tolerated and accepted by citizens and subjects of the states for the sake of social life. We'll talk about the difference between citizen and subject later on. But what for one society might be a minor nuisance, for another can be an intolerable intrusion. The diversity of worldviews, of ideas that we have about what it means to have a good life means that what is totalitarian in one country might be considered fine in another, and what is libertarian in one country might be considered unacceptable to another. You can see that with the debate over gun rights in America within states, but also between the United States of America and other people in other countries of the world. Okay, now there's no easy answer to these questions, because this is absolutely up to what you think is your good life, and then how you use politics to come to a consensus or to impose your will on a powerless minority. Now, do not be fooled by people crying out that the US is a totalitarian state, or this or that country are totalitarian. Very few states are like that nowadays. And the intrusions we are talking about are not some regulations or prohibition of big soft drinks, for example, but thousands of such regulations enforced at gunpoint for much more crucial things. There are totalitarian countries out in the world, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, for example, but even there are pockets and areas of life where the state cannot completely intrude. So be very careful with these terms bandied about. You have to have critical thinking and understand that the reality, from a pragmatic point of view, is much more complex and nuanced. But there is no question that some places are dictatorships, where you do feel that you are drowning all the time, and that hand is holding your head under the water and only letting you breathe now and then. So what about democracy? The basis of democracy is popular sovereignty. No one and nothing stands above the people as the ultimate authority about how the people should decide about politics and economics and what they can decide. As a character in one of my favorite animes pointed out, the only people that can decide, the only authority that can decide to restrict the rights of the people are the people themselves. The people are sovereign. There is no authority above them. In democracy, government gets its legitimacy from responding to the demands of the people. This is unlike authoritarianism, where government often decides what is good for the people. But here's the question: who are the people? In quotation marks. Well, that is a tough one. History shows that who the people are can vary from time to time in democracy to democracy. Women, people of different races, and teens and children have been or are still excluded from the people. Now, the importance of the democratic ideal is not who exactly the people is. It can actually be a very small group, like in the early American politics. What is important is that that small group, as the people, has the sovereign right to decide to extend the membership of the people. Okay? That small group can decide to extend its borders to encompass more and more of the actual population, and more of the people. And this has happened in American history. Initially, the small group only included white landowners and people who had income. And then it expanded to include, and they all were men. We're going to see that before the independence, that was a bit different. Then it expanded to include all white men. Then it expanded to include white men and white women. Then it expanded to include Black Americans, Asian Americans, and other people who had been excluded. And now we have debates on whether to, lower the age and include teens and so on. This is the fundamental importance of the democratic ideal, that people with a capital P have the power to expand who the people are. Of course, that also raises the question and the threat that maybe they also have the power to restrict who the people are, maybe to unexpand, but usually because of the importance of rules and stipulations for the legitimacy and democracy, once you have an expansion, it is coded in the Constitution, it is coded in the rules. It's very hard to change that. That's different. In an authoritarian regime, it's different because that's not the case. Ideology or custom will put a limit to the ability of a regime to change its rules. Whether the Soviet Union wanted it or not, because of its ideology, it could not justify forgiving the children of the old aristocracy and excluding them into false citizenship. Its very ideological idea was based on the idea that those could never be the people, and that could never change. So one could say that once a society decides on a democratic system of government where the people, whoever they are, however big a group they are, the capital P people, are the sovereign decision makers, expansions of the electorate are probable. And once it expands, it sticks in, and only through authoritarian methods, through conquest, defeat in war, or coups d'etat can you see a restriction of that franchise. So ultimately, that's the source of the democracy. That is what democracy is. The who can be expanded by the willingness of the people themselves. But how do the people decide things of democracy? Most of the time by trying to find out what the majority held will is. Majorities are important because in the end, if a majority rejects the political system, the legitimacy of the system collapses and violent force must become the way to rule a country. Force is expensive, remember. In a way, one can say that in democracy, the prejudices held by the majority become the law. On the other hand, it is almost impossible to get everybody to agree on an idea. Furthermore, scarce resources means that there will always be losers and winners until we somehow end scarcity. Consequently, the goal of government in a democracy is to serve the public interest, which usually is inferred from the will of the majority through the technical means of elections. Okay? Now, elections are not necessarily part of the democratic system. They are a means to an end. Ancient democracy used elections, but also used sortition a lot in order to make decisions, which is random lot. Nowadays, election has become the main method because societies believe that they're too big to use sortition. Of course, that might change in the future with technology and so on. So we have tended to, interpret democracy as the same thing as elections, but elections is just a technical means. There are other technical means by which the people can come to a collective decision, including sortition, consensus, discussions, and so on. But elections are useful because in a way they give us an idea of who would win if we went to war, if we went to civil war. Now, this role of the majority, this has led many people who fear majorities to oppose democracy. This could be racial and religious minorities that fear being discriminated against by the majorities, or economic minorities, the most important of which is the rich. The rich are a minority, they're an economic minority. Yes, they have a lot of money and power, but when it comes to numbers, they are the minority. They will be swamped and murdered by the majority, so they have every reason to be afraid. And these minorities have a fear that democracy is a threat to their rights. Instead, they call for republics, which are supposed to be systems of governments where the law is above the will of the people, thus guaranteeing rights to minorities that majorities cannot break. Some go as far as to say that the US was supposed to be a republic and now has become degraded to a democracy. They essentially, if you go back to my Aristotle slide, they essentially equate republic with what Aristotle called democracy, legitimate rule by the many, and they equate democracy with what Aristotle called ochlokratia, which actually means mob rule, which is illegitimate rule of the many. Now, here's the problem with this republic or democracy debate that is very, very popular in America, and you have students that like trolling their professors like me by going on for it. Number one, there is no political system in the world which can survive a majority that is actively against it. Nothing, not a dictator, not a constitution, not a court can defend you if the minority decides to harm you. Only leaving from the country. So in reality, almost every political system de facto exists because it is tolerated by majorities, even if those majorities are disenfranchised. So that's the important first thing. Secondly, people claim that the US Constitution makes this country a republic. But the reality is, as we are going to see from the rules of that same Constitution, that a determined majority could legally amend almost every crucial part of the US Constitution. If this country was supposed to be a republic, as they mean the term republic, the US Constitution will be more like the current German Constitution, which has the German Basic Law, whose important articles cannot be legally amended by the people. The only choice the people have if they don't like them is to completely de-establish the country and make a new country. That's not the US Constitution, as we're going to see. Almost everything that is important can be changed by a majority. Now, it is definitely hard by the rules to create that majority, but it is not impossible, and that's the important thing. You can definitely put hurdles on the power of the majority to change things. But ultimately, if you want a democracy, the majority has to have that power. You might mandate that that majority must be 95% of the population or 75% of the population. Make it very hard. Make it impossible for it to just be 51%. That's fair and fine. Okay? And it's also a question of, whether you want to sacrifice representation or efficiency. Those are two debates over there that we're going to look more when we discuss the actual workings of democracy. But the point remains, 90% can still change it. In America, 3/4 of the population can change the Constitution in almost every part of the Constitution. Finally, this is a meaningless debate because the words actually kind of mean the same thing. The etymology of republic comes from the Latin word res publica, while the Greek word demokratia comes from the word demokratia. And that's pretty much the same. Rule of the public. The publica in the Roman concept and the demos in the Greek concept are not that different as people think, which really meant rule of the electorate through the laws they decided to hold, okay? Now, modern democracies do recognize the fact that there should be limits to the power of temporary majorities. The goal of our legal systems is not to make it impossible for the majority to decide the law, but to make sure that any majority that changes the foundations of a government is not a temporary one, but it is a true, stable majority that truly does represent what most people in the country want. And that want is something that is not something that came out of a fancy, but it has been forming over years. Among such laws that we have to, restrict a bit the ability of temporary or small majorities like 51% to, change the fundamental law or attack the rights of minorities are minority rights in the constitutions that extend from the sanctity of private property through religious and linguistic ones. So in a way, this debate is beside the point. But it is good to be informed of it, since it does turn up now and again in political discourse. In reality, what people mean when they say republic is essentially a lawcracy. In ancient Greek and Greek, nomocracy, or rule of the law, a system of government where laws set at the inception of the country are impervious to alteration from the people later on. The law rather than the people is the sovereign authority, which really means that the lucky people who were alive when those laws were originally conceived are sovereign, even if they are dead for 1,000 years now. In many ways, what many Americans mean as a republic is rule by the dead. Yes, zombie rule. So democracy is about the majority getting to decide what rules bind us all. Should it be like that? Is it even really like that? Well, people disagree. And for many people and scholars, democracy is really a system for legitimizing elite rule by accommodating some of the interests of the majority periodically through a change on which members of the elite conduct policy. As one of the most important scholars of democracy in the world, Przeworski, noted, ultimately, at its very basic and minimalist definition of democracy will be a peaceful way to change elites in government. Now, that doesn't sound very appealing, right? And here's the catch. Democracy guarantees that these changes in rulers are going to be done peacefully. And this is a very big deal. Just look at Syria for what happens when such a system of peaceful turnover does not exist. Many people assume violence is going to be fun, violence is going to be great, they're going to fight in the civil war, they're going to be the tough. That is not a reality for the majority of human beings who live miserable lives in situations like this. So even if we say that elite democracy is not very appealing, even if we call democracy at minimal a system of the peaceful change of elites, that is a big deal. Other scholars and people argue for what they call pluralist democracy, one in which the goal is not so much determining the will of a temporary majority and satisfying it, but instead a system where people, individuals are organized in civil society groups, churches, parties, clubs, and come together to bargain for the most maximalist inclusive agreements. Essentially, a system where elections are only used as a last resort to resolve intractable differences, while the preference is through coming to a maximally accepted consensus by essentially negotiations between organizations of citizens, and this can be any kind of organizations. This a bit can become similar to the authoritarian concept of corporatism. It's not so important for this class, so don't worry about it, so be careful with that, but it is fundamentally the idea of a democracy where the goal is consensus rather than clarifying who is the majority. Many liberals in America support pluralist democracy. And finally, we have participatory democracy. This is the radical version of democracy. Under this story, the democratic system of governance is expanded to every facet of public life. We vote and decide on everything, including what products can be sold in a town, what businesses can operate, who can use a park, and so on. Essentially, society controls and decides everything. That is partly the idea of ancient Greek democracy, where the demos essentially had the power to vote on many of these things. Now, this is different in form than state socialism, in which the states control and decides everything. But is it in substance? I mean, do you want the community to decide if you can go to college or not? Do you want the community to decide if you can work this job or that job or not? Do you want the community to decide if you can live in the community or not? Big questions. That's things that you have to decide on your end.